It can be tough, right? Keeping up with everything, figuring out what really sets apart those who just, well, manage from those who truly excel.
Absolutely. There's so much information out there, it's easy to get overwhelmed.
Totally. That's why you sent this in. You want us to break it down for you, right?
Yeah.
Peter Drucker's What Makes an Effective Executive? From that Harvard Business Review Classic series, no less.
A classic for a reason. It's packed with insights, and it's amazing how relevant it still is for anyone who wants to make a real impact today.
Okay, so we're going deep, a proper deep dive into Drucker for you. We'll pull out those core principles of what makes an executive truly effective. Ready?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Now, when you hear executive, what pops into your head? Maybe someone super charismatic, a real visionary, a big personality.
Right, the stereotypical leader, maybe.
Exactly. But Drucker, he kind of flips that on its head. His big question, the one he really wants you to think about, is this. What actually makes an executive effective? Is it something you're just born with, some kind of magical leadership gene?
Or is it something else, something you can learn and develop?
That's what's so interesting. Drucker argues that effectiveness, it boils down to practices, things you can actually do, rather than some innate talent. It's almost like a skill you can hone.
And he starts by challenging that assumption that you need to be a dazzling personality to be a successful leader. Take Harry Truman, for example. Not exactly known for his charisma, was he?
Not a smooth talker, but definitely got things done.
Precisely. And he's widely considered one of the most effective U.S. presidents. And this is what fascinated Drucker, Throughout his career, all that consulting work, he saw that the most effective executives, they didn't fit any one mold.
They came from all walks of life, didn't they?
They did. They were incredibly diverse. Their personalities, attitudes, values, strength, even their weaknesses, all over the map.
Some were real extroverts, right? Out there front and center. Others were more well-reserved. Some were super relaxed, laid back. And then you had the micromanagers, was a serious control enthusiast. Some were incredibly generous. Others, surprisingly frugal. It's like a real mix.
A real mix. And that's what makes Drucker's findings so powerful. It wasn't about who these executives were, but what they did.
So he was looking for those common threads, those actions that made them effective, regardless of their personality.
Exactly. And he identified 8 core practices that he observed. All these effective executives, no matter how different they were, they all did these things. They asked what needs to be done, and then they'd follow that up with what is right for the enterprise.
Okay, so 2 key questions right off the bat.
Then they develop action plans, take responsibility for their decisions, take responsibility for communicating those decisions, focus on opportunities rather than getting stuck on problems, run productive meetings.
Trying to squeeze a lot in there. Anything else?
One more. They thought and spoke using we instead of I.
Interesting. So those are the 8 practices. And Drucker actually groups them in a way that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
The first 2, those questions, what needs to be done? And what is right for the enterprise? Those are all about gathering knowledge.
Precisely. Getting that foundational understanding.
Then the next 4, developing action plans, taking responsibility for decisions, for communicating, and focusing on opportunities, those are all about putting that knowledge into action, making it happen.
Making it real, turning knowledge into results.
And then the last 2, the productive meetings and the we thinking, those are about building responsibility and accountability throughout the whole organization.
Exactly. It's a system, a framework for creating a culture of effectiveness.
Okay, so let's dive into those first 2 knowledge-gathering practices, starting with what needs to be done. Now, it seems kind of basic, right? But Drucker, he emphasizes that this isn't about what you want to do, your personal goals. It's about what's truly necessary for the success of the entire enterprise.
He wants you to step back and look at the bigger picture. What needs to happen for the organization to thrive?
It's about objectivity, really, not getting caught up in your own agenda. And he uses Truman as a great example of this, right? When Truman came into office, his initial focus was all about domestic policy.
Continuing Roosevelt's New Deal, that was his priority.
Right, but then he asked himself what needs to be done. And he realized that the urgent priority, the thing that really needed his attention, was managing foreign policy in that post-war world.
And Drucker makes the point that Truman actually restructured his whole day. He immersed himself in foreign affairs. And it's fascinating to think, those huge decisions he made containing communism, the Marshall Plan.
World-changing events.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they stemmed from asking that one question, what needs to be done? It shows you the power of stepping back and reassessing.
It's about adapting, right? Changing your focus based on what's truly needed. Drucker also brings in Jack Welch at GE. When Welch took over, he might have had his own ideas about expanding globally, but he asked that same question. what needs to be done. And the answer he came up with was, well, kind of radical.
Radical, how so?
He realized that GE needed to get rid of businesses that couldn't be number one or two in their industries. Even if those businesses were profitable, they were holding GE back in the long run. It was about facing that tough reality.
It's that willingness to make hard choices, to prioritize the long-term health of the enterprise. And, it's tempting to try to tackle everything at once, but Drucker is very clear on this. Effective executives, they don't try to do it all, they focus.
You mean they don't multitask?
But everyone multitasks these days.
It's almost a badge of honor, isn't it? But Drucker argues that trying to juggle too many things actually makes you less effective. Ideally, he says, you should concentrate on one task at a time.
One thing.
Really?
Yeah. He acknowledges that some people, a very small number, can effectively manage two tasks at the same time, alternating between them. But beyond that, he says he never encountered an executive who could truly be effective while juggling more than two major priorities.
So it's about setting those top one or two priorities and sticking with them. Like, what kinds of things would those be?
It depends on the situation, of course, but Drucker gives examples like a CEO who needs to redefine the company's mission, or a unit head who needs to clarify their relationship with the head office. Those are the kind of big picture tasks that require real focus.
It makes sense, but then the world changes, right? Priorities shift. So how do you stay on top of that?
Drucker emphasizes the importance of regularly resetting those priorities. Once you've accomplished that top task, you don't just move on to the next item on the old list. You ask yourself again, what must be done now?
You're constantly reassessing, looking at the situation with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And he brings back Jack Welch here, mentioning how every 5 years Welch would ask himself, what needs to be done now? And each time he'd come up with a new top priority.
He wasn't afraid to shake things up. And that's where that focus comes in again, right? Choosing the right task to focus on.
Absolutely. Drucker says that before Welch would decide what to focus on for the next 5 years, he'd consider which of the top 2 or 3 tasks he was best suited to undertake. He'd then concentrate on that one and delegate the others.
So it's about playing to your strengths, knowing what you're good at and what you're better off handing over to someone else.
And understanding that your performance as an executive, it has a ripple effect. It impacts the entire organization.
Okay, that brings us to the second knowledge gathering question. What is right for the enterprise? This one seems even bigger, doesn't it? It's not just about what needs to be done, but what's the right thing to do.
It adds an ethical dimension, a sense of long-term responsibility. Drucker is very clear that this question, it overrides the interests of any single stakeholder group.
So not just the owners or the employees or even the executives themselves.
Not even the stock price. He acknowledges that all those groups are important, of course. Shareholders need returns, employees need to be engaged, the stock price has to be healthy.
All those things are interconnected.
They are. But Drucker's point is that if a decision isn't fundamentally right for the long-term health of the enterprise, then it ultimately won't be good for any of those stakeholders. It's a long-term perspective.
It's about sustainability, isn't it? Making sure the organization can thrive over time.
Exactly. And he stresses that this is particularly important for family-owned businesses, especially when it comes to personnel decisions.
That can be tricky, right? Promoting family members, balancing loyalty with what's best for the business.
It is. But Drucker points to companies like DuPont and J. Lyons and Company. These successful family businesses, they had a clear principle. Family members were only promoted if they were demonstrably superior to non-family members at the same level.
And that judgment, it was made by non-family managers. That's a real commitment to objectivity, isn't it?
It is. It's about putting the enterprise first. And Drucker makes this really important point. Asking what is right for the enterprise doesn't guarantee that you'll make the perfect decision every time. Executives are human. They're going to make mistakes.
But at least you're asking the right questions, trying to make the best possible decision.
Precisely. Not asking that fundamental question that virtually guarantees that you'll make the wrong decision in the long run. So it's a guiding principle, something to always keep in mind.
Okay, so you've gathered the knowledge, you've asked those 2 crucial questions. Now it's time to put that knowledge into action. And the first practice Drucker outlines here is developing action plans.
Right. It's not enough just to know what needs to be done and what's right. You need a roadmap, a plan to get there.
So how do you build an effective action plan? What are the key components?
First, you need to clearly define the desired results, the specific outcomes you're aiming for, and you need deadlines. Ask yourself, what contributions should the enterprise expect from me? What specific results will I commit to achieving? And by when?
So it's about setting clear expectations for yourself and for everyone involved.
Then it's about thinking carefully about any potential constraints, anything that might limit your actions. Drucker suggests asking yourself, is this course of action ethical? Is it culturally acceptable within the organization? Is it legal? And crucially, is it compatible with our mission, our values, our policies?
So you're not just charging ahead blindly. You're considering the boundaries, the rules of the game.
And just because something is ethical and legal, it doesn't guarantee success. But violating those restraints, that almost always leads to trouble down the line.
It's about operating within the system, but also being smart about it. And an action plan, it's not set in stone, is it? It needs to be flexible, adaptable.
Exactly. It's more like a statement of intentions, and it needs to be revisited and revised frequently. Successes will often create new opportunities, and so will failures. The business environment changes, the market shifts, people within the organization change. A good action plan anticipates this need for flexibility.
It's a living document, constantly evolving. And to make sure you're staying on track, Drucker emphasizes those check-in points, right? Those moments where you stop and assess your progress.
Absolutely. He recommends at least 2 formal review points. One midway through the plan's time frame, and another at the very end before you start drafting the next plan. These are opportunities to really look at whether you're moving towards those initial goals you set.
Makes sense. You need to course correct, adjust your approach based on what's happening. And then the action plan, it dictates how you spend your time, which is so valuable for an executive.
Time is the ultimate resource, isn't it? Drucker famously called it an executive's scarcest and most precious resource, and he points out that organizations can be real time wasters.
Oh yeah, those endless meetings, the constant interruptions.
Exactly. So your action plan, if it's going to be effective, it has to dictate how you allocate your time. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper.
He even uses Napoleon as an example here. He says that no successful battle ever unfolded exactly according to the initial plan, but Napoleon still planned meticulously beforehand.
It's the act of planning itself that's so valuable. It forces you to think things through, to anticipate challenges.
And then when things inevitably change, you're better equipped to adapt because you have that foundation.
Precisely. Without a plan, without those regular check-ins, you risk becoming purely reactive, just responding to whatever pops up. You lose sight of the bigger picture.
So you've got your plan, you're taking action. Now comes the next practice, taking responsibility for your decisions. This seems pretty straightforward, but Drucker, he has very specific points here.
It's about accountability, making sure decisions are actually implemented. Drucker says a decision isn't truly made until it's crystal clear who's accountable, what the deadline is, who's affected and needs to be involved, and who simply needs to be informed.
So it's not just making the decision in your head. It's about communicating it, making sure everyone knows what's happening.
And he tells that story about the client who lost a huge chunk of market share in Japan just because they didn't communicate a specification change.
A specification change? Sounds pretty minor.
It was. They started using meters in kilograms instead of feet and pounds, but they didn't tell their Japanese partners.
Oh, wow. So even small things, they can have a big impact if they're not communicated clearly.
Absolutely. And Drucker stresses the importance of reviewing past decisions. Not just making them, but actually going back and seeing how they played out.
Learning from your mistakes.
Exactly. And he says this is especially crucial for decisions about hiring and promotion. Those are high-stakes decisions, and they don't always work out.
He says only about a third of those decisions actually turn out to be truly successful in the long run. That's a pretty low success rate.
It is. Another third, they're kind of in the middle, neither great successes nor outright failures. And the final third, they're outright failures.
So what does an effective executive do with that knowledge?
They check in on those decisions. Within 6 to 9 months, they take a look and see how things are going. And if a decision isn't working out, they don't automatically blame the individual. They first consider it their own mistake in judgment.
It's about taking ownership, isn't it? Recognizing your own role in the decision-making process.
And that creates a culture of learning where it's okay to make mistakes as long as you learn from them, but they also have to take responsibility for addressing individuals who aren't performing well, even if it wasn't entirely their fault.
So you can't just let things slide, even if you feel bad for someone.
Right. Their continued lack of performance, it can damage the whole organization. And Drucker suggests offering them the option to return to a previous role and salary.
That's interesting. He says it's not often taken up, but just having that option available can have a positive effect on the culture.
It encourages people to take risks, to try new things, knowing there's a safety net.
In reviewing decisions, it's not just about fixing mistakes, right? It's also about self-development, learning about yourself as an executive.
Absolutely. By looking at the results of your decisions, you can identify your strengths, your weaknesses, your biases. You can see where your judgment needs to improve.
You're constantly learning, refining your approach. And what about areas where you're just not competent, where you don't have the expertise?
That's where delegation comes in. Drucker says every executive has weaknesses. There's no such thing as someone who's brilliant at everything.
So know your limitations.
And empower others, people who have those skills and expertise that you lack.
And it's not just about executives making decisions, right? In today's world, decisions are made at all levels of an organization.
Especially in knowledge-based companies, those decisions made by people who are the real experts in their field, they can have a huge impact.
So it's about empowering people throughout the organization to make good decisions.
Exactly. Teaching decision-making skills, fostering a culture of informed decision-making.
Okay, the next practice is taking responsibility for communication. It seems like that goes hand in hand with decision-making.
They're definitely intertwined. Effective executives, they make sure their plans, their information needs are clearly understood by everyone they work with. Their superiors, their subordinates, their peers.
So communication is flowing in all directions, not just top-down.
Right, and it's not just about pushing information out, it's also about making sure you're receiving the information you need.
So being proactive, asking for what you need.
Exactly. And he criticizes those executives who treat information flow as the responsibility of specialists like the IT department.
So don't just assume the information will magically appear.
Go out and get it. Identify what you need, ask for it, and follow up until you receive it.
Now let's talk about focusing on opportunities rather than problems. This one's interesting. It's not that problems aren't important, but the emphasis should be different.
Right. Problems need to be addressed, of course. But problem solving, it's really about preventing damage, maintaining the status quo.
It's about staying afloat.
Exactly. It's opportunities that drive growth, innovation, real progress.
So it's about looking at change, not as a threat, but as a potential opportunity.
And Drucker, he actually provides you with a list of 7 situations to watch for, 7 places where opportunities might be hiding.
7. Let's hear them.
Okay, first, unexpected successes or failures, whether they happen in your company, your competitor's company, or the industry as a whole.
So something surprising happens and you think, what does this mean? What can we learn from this?
Exactly. Second, gaps between what is and what could be. This could be in a product, a service, a process, a whole market segment.
Like what's missing? What's not being addressed?
He uses the example of the 19th century paper industry, which focused only on a small part of the tree, the part that could be made into wood pulp. They were completely ignoring the rest of the tree.
Talk about a missed opportunity.
Huge missed opportunity. Third, innovation. Whether it's a new process, product, or service, and whether it comes from inside or outside your organization.
So keeping an eye on what's new, what's changing the game.
Fourth, changes in industry and market structure.
Like new competitors emerging, or maybe consolidation happening among existing companies?
Right. Fifth, demographic shifts. Changes in population size, age, other characteristics.
So paying attention to how the world is changing, who your customers are becoming.
Sixth, changes in mindset, values, perceptions, mood, even the meaning people ascribe to things.
This is about those deeper cultural shifts, the underlying trends that shape how people think and behave.
And finally, seventh, new knowledge in technology.
That's a big one these days. AI, automation, all those advances changing everything.
And Drucker emphasizes that you have to prevent problems from overshadowing opportunities.
So don't get so caught up in fixing things that you forget to look for new possibilities.
He even suggests listing opportunities on the first page of management reports and problems on the second.
So you're forced to address opportunities first.
And when it comes to staffing, put your best people on those opportunities, not just on fixing problems.
And he describes a process where management teams create lists of opportunities and top performers and then try to match them up.
This happens every 6 months. And in Japan, this is seen as a key function of HR. They take it very seriously.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on to the final section, ensuring company-wide accountability. And the first practice here is running productive meetings. We've all been in those meetings that feel like a total waste of time, haven't we?
More than a few, I'd say. And Drucker points out that executives spend a huge amount of time in meetings.
More than half their day sometimes.
So making those meetings productive is crucial. He says they should be work sessions, not just discussions.
So have a clear objective, an outcome you're aiming for.
And the key, he says, is deciding beforehand what type of meeting it's going to be. Different types of meetings require different preparation and have different goals.
So what are some of those different types?
Well, if you're preparing a statement, an announcement, a press release, then you need a draft beforehand, and someone should be assigned to disseminate the final version. If it's just a straightforward announcement, then stick to that. No rambling. If someone's giving a report, the discussion should focus on the report itself.
Keep it focused.
If there are multiple reports, have them distributed beforehand and enforce time limits. If it's a meeting to inform the executive, then the executive should mainly listen and ask questions, not dominate the conversation. And then there are those meetings that are just about being in the presence of the senior executive.
What Drucker calls penalties of rank. Not very productive.
Not at all. So self-discipline is key here. Stick to the purpose of the meeting and end it as soon as that purpose is achieved.
No going off on tangents.
And the meeting itself is only half the battle. The follow-up is just as important.
In Drucker's example here is Alfred Sloan of General Motors. He was a master of meeting follow-up.
Sloan would start the meeting by stating its purpose. Then he'd listen intently, rarely speaking except to ask clarifying questions. And at the end, he'd summarize the decisions made.
But then came the magic, right? The famous Sloan memos.
Exactly. Immediately after the meeting, he'd write a short memo summarizing the discussion, the conclusions, and any work assignments with deadlines and who was responsible, and he'd copy everyone who attended.
So everyone knew what was expected of them, and they were held accountable.
It was a simple system, but incredibly effective. And Drucker's point is that a meeting is either productive or it's a waste of time. There's no middle ground.
Okay, the final practice. Thinking and speaking in terms of we instead of I. This one seems more about mindset than a specific action.
It is. It's about shifting your perspective. Drucker says that while executives have ultimate responsibility, their authority comes from the trust of the organization.
So it's not about wielding power, it's about earning respect.
And that means consistently putting the needs of the organization above your own personal interests.
Putting we before I.
And it's not easy. It takes discipline, constant self-awareness.
And then Drucker adds one final rule, almost like a bonus tip. Listen first, speak last.
He emphasizes that effective executives, they come in all shapes and sizes. But what unites them is their ability to get the right things done. And while some people might be naturally inclined towards effectiveness, Drucker believes that it's a discipline, something you can learn and practice.
So to recap those 8 practices, asking what needs to be done and what is right for the enterprise. Developing action plans, taking responsibility for decisions in communication, focusing on opportunities, running productive meetings, thinking we instead of I, and of course, listening first, speaking last.
Those are the keys to effectiveness, according to Drucker.
And as you've been listening, you've probably been thinking about your own work, your own situation. Which of these practices resonates most with you? Which one could you start applying today to make a real difference?
It's about finding what works for you, adapting these principles to your own context. And we encourage you to go back and read Drucker's original article. There's so much depth there that we couldn't cover everything today.
And to leave you with one final thought, thinking about that question, what needs to be done? What's one crucial task that you might be overlooking right now? What's something that's really important, something that deserves your focused attention? Take some time to reflect on that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.